What I would like to do today is I'd like to talk about the changing dynamics of territory and borders within the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I do have an interesting documentary we made about it as part of a European borders research project, but that will have to wait till the end. And if necessary, I can always leave the file here. Actually, it can actually be found on YouTube, and you can actually watch it afterwards at your own leisure to complement what I'm going to say today. I want to talk about this slide that you see behind me or in front of you, and that is the slide of a map, a caricature. I collect border caricatures showing various diplomats and politicians and academics trying to redraw the border between Israel and the West Bank as part of what we discuss so much, the so-called two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Obviously, there are many, many dimensions of conflict resolution, of peace processes, if they be, and I'm sure as you're all students of Israel studies, you know that it's about refugees, it's about water, it's about borders, it's about Jerusalem, it's about security, and it's about history and identity. It's about many, many different dimensions and many different aspects. I'm particularly interested in the territorial focus. My wider work, academic work, is in geopolitics. It's on the theoretization of borders in the modern era. My local case study is, of course, Israel-Palestine. I actually live in a community of Metar, just 3 kilometers south of the southernmost point of the West Bank. And when I choose to drive to Jerusalem, I can choose to drive around the West Bank at 120 kilometers or straight through the West Bank at 70 kilometers. A little bit more dangerous. It used to be a lot quicker, but with the new cross highway in Israel, I'm not sure it's quicker. But of course, and when I do that, I cross two borders. I go into the West Bank at one end, I come out of the West Bank near Gush Etzion at the other end, and these are real borders. I mean, they may only be called separation barriers or security fences, but they are real borders. Your car is checked, your papers are checked, depending on whether you're Israeli or Palestinian, you're allowed to cross, depending on what your license plates on the car are. So there are visual elements and documentation which enable you to cross from one side of the border to the other side of the border. And I want to talk around this context of borders and territory over the next 40-45 minutes, show you a few slides, and maybe open it up for discussion. Leave some very open questions, not very clear conclusions at the end. I think there are about 6 or 7 points I want to make during this short presentation. Point number 1, Israel has 5 borders. 5 borders or potential borders, with Lebanon, with Syria, with Jordan, with Egypt, and maybe with a future Palestinian state, but clearly with the West Bank today, it has a border, separation barrier. Of those 5 borders, 2 are recognized internationally as international borders, the border between Israel and Egypt and the border between Israel and Jordan, by virtue of the fact that Israel has signed a peace agreement with each of those countries. Camp David peace agreement with Egypt at the end of the 70s, the early 80s, which formalized the withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula and the eventual determination or international delimitation of the border between Israel and Egypt. One small point, the Taba went to international arbitration. It was eventually decided it would go to Egypt, and we have an international border with Egypt. A few years later, in the mid-1990s, Israel signed a peace agreement with Jordan, and the border between Israel and Jordan was formalized, or at least part of the border between Israel and Jordan was formalized, the section from the West Bank going north to the border with Syria, and a section from the south of the West Bank going south along the Arava, the Jordan Valley, the Arava, as far as Egypt, were formalized. but Jordan refused to sign on the border between Israel, between the West Bank and Jordan, because they said this was for a future Palestinian authority to sign. It wasn't for Israel to sign, even though we know exactly where that border is. It's along the Jordan River, or what used to be called the Jordan River. It's not much of a river these days, but we know exactly the location, just as we knew the location of most of the Israel-Egypt border. But by virtue of the peace agreements, these are internationally recognized borders. The borders with Lebanon and Syria are not recognized internationally. With Lebanon, it is the armistice line from 1948. Remember that following the war, Israel's War of Independence, the Palestinian Nakba, that there were 5 separate negotiations which took place between Israel and her neighbors. And although their lines were drawn, they were not part of a formal peace agreement as such, and therefore to this day they are armistice lines only. Yes, in many cases we know exactly where the line will be, or 95%. Nevertheless, they have not been part of a formal peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon. We were, of course, much closer to signing a peace agreement with Lebanon in the past than we are today. Today it's a very sensitive border. And when Israel withdrew from Lebanon after its occupation of that area from the 1980s through to the year 2000, it withdrew to that same international line which had been drawn up as the line between the British and the French mandates going back almost 100 years to the imposition of the mandates on the region after World War I and after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. The border between Israel and Syria, of course, is much more questionable because the armistice line, which was agreed upon in 1948-49, was down by the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. In 1967, of course, Israel captured, conquered, liberated, use whatever term you feel happy with. I'm not here to engage in a sort of a political polemic over the terminologies we use. But of course, Israel now controls or occupies the Golan Heights. And if and when there is ever to be any form of agreement or conflict resolution between Israel and Syria, the Golan Heights is a major issue which has to be determined. Of course, today the issue between Israel and Syria is far, far more sensitive than it's probably been at any point in the last 30 or 40 years because of what's been going on and which is happening right now with Iranian influence, with Hezbollah influence, with the Syrian state not clear where it stands. And of course, most recently, President Trump has made a very significant statement about whether Israel has a right to claim sovereignty over parts of the Golan Heights, which in a sense has turned the cards because this is a statement which has never been made before, not by an American president and not by other world leaders. And then there is a 5th potential border between Israel and a future Palestinian state. The border that we know, the one you see on this slide here, is of course the Green Line, which was also drawn up as part of the armistice talks in 1949. Jordan was then administered or controlled the West Bank, and the Green Line, as we know it, is the border, in a sense, the default boundary, but I think it's clear to everyone engaged in conflict resolution that if there was to be a satisfactory border between a future two-state solution, the Green Line is by no means the optimum line, not for either of the two sides, and an optimal solution would necessitate the redrawing of that border. It wasn't an optimal line in 1949, and certainly 70 years have gone. I'm going to say something about this time differential in a few minutes, but clearly it would really need to be a bilaterally negotiated line. What we have today is the separation barrier, or the security barrier, is only 70% along the Green Line, 30% it deviates from the Green Line where settlements have been built, and of course it's a border which is unilaterally imposed by Israel. It's not, the separation barrier is not a line or a barrier which has been agreed by both sides. So that's point number 1 within the wider context of borders. There are 5 borders out there. Israel, I don't like using the unique discussions about Israel, we do it a bit too much. But in this sense, Israel is unique in the sense that most of its borders, land borders, are not internationally agreed borders, whereas that tends to be, although it tends to be a bit of a passé situation in international relations and international politics, there are many issues relating to borders today which we as border scholars deal with, but they are not so much involved with the delimitation, the demarcation issues. They're more involved with the management, the negotiation of borders, how they are controlled, how they are managed, who's allowed to cross, whether we're rebuilding the walls, as is happening a lot today because of securitization and homeland politics. But the actual location, the demarcation of 98% of the world's land borders is there. That's not an issue. One or two cases in the world where it's still an issue. Israel is one of those cases. Point number two, very important to make, and since you all study Israel, I assume I don't have to belabor this point. We're talking about a very small piece of real estate. The whole of Israel and the occupied territories is 25,000 square kilometers. Take out the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip, and we're down to 20,000 square kilometers. I don't need to tell you that in the context of where I'm sitting today in India, that's not just small, that's minuscule. I think people in the world realize that Israel is a small state, makes a lot more noise than its size should allow for, but they don't realize just how small it is. And when you remember that the closest point between the coastal plain and the West Bank from about the town of Netanya is no more than 15 kilometers. I mean, you don't even get through a third of Delhi on that. We have to take that into context. Over 70 years, if you look at three of the major parameters of political decision making, two have changed significantly, one has not changed at all. Demography has changed over 70 years or over 80 years. When Israel was established, there were approximately 600,000-700,000 Israeli/Jews. A similar number of Palestinians became refugees. There were, of course, a few 100,000 Palestinians or Arabs at the time who were divided between the West Bank and Israel, and therefore took on different citizenships and different state positions, despite the fact that prior to that there had never been a border and there was no differentiation between these two populations. From less than 1 million people today, we have, whether you're talking with the occupied territories, without the occupied territories, we're talking about 9-10 million people today. So obviously demography has changed considerably, with the basic ratios remaining within Israel approximately around the 80 to 20% mark, between Israel and the West Bank, between the, let's say, 55, 45 or 58, 42%. And of course that's a major issue as populations grow dynamically, and there is always the argument that, of course, give or take another 20, 30, 40 years with the same population figures, then there's going to be parity between the two populations. So demography has changed. Power has changed very significantly in that 70 years, because prior to 1948 you had a British mandate, you had two local populations, a Palestinian Jewish population. The concept of the word Israel only came into being when the state was established, and you had a Palestinian Arab population. Since Israel then later adopted the term Israel, it never used the concept of Palestinian anymore, so the Palestinians became a term which has become only associated with the Arab side of the conflict. But you have a number of elderly people living in Israel today who were alive at the time of the mandate, and they will proudly show you and say, look, I have a Palestinian laissez-faire or a passport from the British mandate period. But of course power symmetries have changed considerably, because today you have a very strong and sovereign state of Israel. You have a Palestinian population of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip who are stateless, they do not have citizenship. And there is a very different sort of dynamic in terms of power at the time of the British, as the British did everywhere, and I don't need to tell people in India about this. They were very good at playing off the local populations against each other, speaking to them separately and differently, so they would never, God forbid, get together to drive the British out. I think they did that very much so with the Arabs and the Jews in Palestine, with the Muslims and the Hindu and others here in India. And remember that India and Israel became independent within 1 year of each other following the departure of the British. The size may be hugely different, but there are many other political and historical similarities between the two situations. And both countries, of course, underwent partition as a result of, in India much more directly, in Israel-Palestine after the war of independence, but they both underwent partition following their independence. But the scale is something we have to remember. Okay, so demography and power changed significantly, territory remained the same. Unless you're going to start building thousands of square kilometers into the sea, it remains the same 1,000 square kilometers. But of course, the insignificance of a much greater population and different power symmetries means that the dynamics constantly change. They constantly change. The growth of settlements, the growth of populations, the growth of political power, and therefore the one constant remains the territorial constant. Point number 3, and I think this is a very important point to talk about, because in the last few years we've been saying a lot about 50 years since the Six-Day War, 70 years since the State of Israel. Actually last week, well, Israel celebrated its 71st Independence Day. We tend to very blithely use this concept of saying, if and when we get to peace, then there's a default boundary, it's a 1967 boundary, we need to take a picture image of what was there then and go back to that situation. Now, you can be the biggest peacenik, pro-peace activist on the left of Israeli politics that there is, but that is an unrealistic statement to make for a number of reasons. One is because 70 years has passed since the establishment of the state. The 19 years, or less than 19 years, passed between the establishment of the state and the Six-Day War in June 1967. Since 1967, over 50 years has passed. In other words, nearly 3 times as much time has passed since the Six-Day War as existed between the establishment of the state and the Six-Day War. And in that 50 years, many things on the ground have changed. I'm not saying that they are morally justified, they are legal, illegal. Obviously, depending on your own political positions, you'll adopt a different interpretation of that. But you cannot avoid the fact, and I say this as a past geographer, that when you've had 50 years of building infrastructure and roads and settlements and public institutions, that changes the nature of the geographical and geopolitical landscape to a great extent. And it's not something that can be blindly wiped out. It's not something you can say that, okay, everything between 48 and 67 was legitimate, therefore it's permanent. Everything from 67 until today is legitimate or illegitimate question mark, and is all temporary. 70 years doesn't give you temporariness, it gives you permanence. And therefore, when you come into discussing future borders and future territorial arrangements, you have to take the realities of the geographical situation today. You have to barter, you have to negotiate, you have to exchange, you have to compromise. But you have to accept that the realities have changed very significantly, and it's a very blithe thing always to go back and say, well, let's go back, take a picture of where we were in 67, and automatically go back there. Time doesn't allow you, time and geographical change on the ground doesn't allow you to do that. Point number 4, or was that 3 or 4? The next point to make is to say that over the past 25 years since the Oslo agreements, we've spent a lot of time talking about borders. Let me just race through to the next one I want to show you. And I think many of you are familiar with this. Here you have a small piece of territory where the borders have changed so constantly. You look at the second map, which was the UNSCOP partition proposal. You look at the third map, which is the actual partition of Israel-Palestine that resulted from the war, remember that Israel's territorial posture would have been a lot worse had the partition proposal been accepted by all sides and had that been the eventual map of the State of Israel. It's very interesting that the famous Israeli diplomat Abba Eban, when he was in America at the beginning of the 50s, and he was in his 30s, that's all, and he was the first ambassador of Israel to both the United States and to United Nations. Think of that, at the age of 30, taking on such a task. He once wrote to Ben-Gurion, this is written in one of his autobiographies at least, and said, look, this was about 1952, 4 years after the establishment of the state, and he said, look, maybe we didn't plan for our borders to work out in the way they did, but there was a war, these are the armistice lines, now let's sue for peace. Let's go to the Arab nations and say this is a reality, let's talk peace, and let's determine that these boundaries are internationally recognized boundaries. And Ben-Gurion turned around, according to what Abba Eban writes, and said no. He said, better they remain as armistice lines. That way they are more flexible, so that if in the future some changes come about, this would be, in a sense, more legitimate. I don't know if that's the right word to use. And of course, no one could have prophesied that 15 years later there would be the Six-Day War, which would bring that into effect. Not that the world accepts Israel's control of the occupied territories, but think how much even more difficult and more critical it would be had these been internationally recognized boundaries. As it was, of course, in 1952, the Arab states weren't interested in doing business with Israel, so, it was never a discussion that took place. We go through other periods of borders as well here. But as I say, in the last 25 years, we have spent a lot of time talking about borders, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the potential of a two-state solution. And if you look at this caricature here, I collect border caricatures, by the way, not just of Israel-Palestine, of all border situations. If any of you come across interesting caricatures about borders, if they're from South Asia, if they're from India, Pakistan, from anywhere in the world, look up my email and send them to me, please. Okay, I'm interested in them. But caricatures tell you a lot about political realities. I mean, they are humorous on the one hand, but they tell you a lot about what people think about different political situations. If you look today at the number of caricatures about Brexit and migration in Europe and borders in Europe, you'll see a lot of this thinking taking place. So here we have Independence Day 45. So that already is 25 years ago. Oslo was 25 years ago, when we were all euphoric because we were convinced that Israel and Palestine were going to have a peace agreement. Maybe we were naive, but things didn't quite work out that way. And here you have the map of the State of Israel on the weighing scales, with a rather extended stomach like the one that I have. And he has a very severe-looking coach or trainer who, if you remember, was Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin at the time, and a lot of spectators, Yasser Arafat, President Assad the father, King Hussein the father, and the Prime Minister or President of Lebanon. And basically the map of Israel is saying to these coaches, how much of this shape do I have to change in order to satisfy all of those people sitting around? And basically that's been the question back to the 1930s. How do you create the sort of territorial situation which enables both sides to be equally dissatisfied? There's no such thing as equal satisfaction. If one side is totally satisfied, it means that the other side is totally dissatisfied. You have to have equal dissatisfaction for good conflict resolution, and each side has to believe that the other side has given up as much, has given up something as important as my own side has given up, in order for that conflict resolution to be reached. And you'll note that I always use the term conflict resolution and not peace agreement, because peace is a much bigger thing. It's a much more abstract concept. It sort of assumes that we all suddenly love each other and we trade with each other and we interact with each other. But you have to first of all reach conflict resolution. I think one of the reasons we've been so dissatisfied with the way that the peace processes have all collapsed is because we expected too much to happen in too short a term, plus the fact that the peace spoilers on both sides did their very best to ensure that it would fail, and there were peace spoilers on both sides, very different types of peace spoilers, which we don't have the time to discuss right now. So there have been many attempts to redraw the line since that sort of reality of the Oslo came in. But of course, borders are very complex processes. Here you see another caricature of Rabin and Arafat trying to draw a border. It's not just a question of drawing a single line, because different functions have different borders. One border is for security, a different border is for identity, a different border is for citizenship, a different border is for water, a different border is for strategic issues, a different border is for transportation infrastructure. Now, if it was as complex as that caricature would indicate 25 years ago, think how much more complex it's become today. Think of the fact that if today there are 500,000 almost Israeli/Jewish residents/settlers of the West Bank, not including East Jerusalem, there was less than half that number at the time of the Oslo Accords. So that's one of the points I made about geographical realities changing the situation. Settlements do impact upon borders. They do impact on the ability to make a peace agreement. And the more that there are on the ground, the more complex and the more difficult it becomes over time. As I say, borders are not simplistic. It's not just drawing a single straight line. It's much more complex than that. If you look at the Oslo map here, then what you see is, of course, that the Oslo agreements were transitory agreements. They weren't permanent agreements. What they did was they divided up the West Bank into 3 different territorial zones. Areas A, Areas B, and Areas C. Areas A were the full Palestinian autonomy, which included about 20+% of the territory, but about 70 to 80% of the population. All the major urban areas like Jericho, Ramallah, Jenin, Hebron, and so on, Al-Khalil, and so on. Areas B were the rest of the Palestinian villages, which had a larger area with a smaller population, and Area C, where Israel retained total control, the white areas you see there, including all of the Jordan Valley, because at the time the concept of the Jordan Valley being Israel's eastern defensible border was still very much a concept. Netanyahu has brought it back a bit, but that has disappeared over time because the technology of warfare has changed. Today we live in an era of missiles from the Gaza Strip, from Lebanon, 20 years ago, 30 years ago from Iraq, and borders don't provide that function anymore. Borders don't stop missiles. Wherever you build it, whether you build a wall or a fence or anything else, borders don't stop the simplest of missiles, as unfortunately we know, particularly if, as I do, we live in the south of the country. But borders have many other functions. That doesn't mean to say borders are insignificant. They don't have the same security function they once had, and because any form of missile simply goes beyond the border, and today the way to deal with these missiles is by all sorts of sophisticated anti-ballistic missile technology, Iron Dome policies, and so on. So the issue of whether the Jordan Valley really represents any form of defensible border for Israel today, if you go back to the 70s and you read the famous paper by Yigal Allon in Foreign Affairs, The Case for Defensible Borders, then it was very significant. Today that's very questionable, not just in Israel, but all over the world. What is the security function of a security function against armies and missiles? Against infiltration, that's something different, which is why Israel, rightly or wrongly, built the security barrier, the separation fence. And here you see another map of the same thing. The fact that it says B'Tselem at the bottom, which is of course a human rights organization, is meaningless. This is a map from the Foreign Office site, and which all groups, left and right wing, tended to adopt at one point. And this is already going back 10 years, this map. And again, you see the different colours, the sort of cheeseboard territories which were created as a result of Oslo. The idea being at Oslo that within 5 years, the 5 big issues, Jerusalem borders, refugees, water, what's the one I've missed out? Whatever, the 5 big issues were to be discussed and finalised within 5 years. During that 5 years, the peace spoilers on both sides did their best to destroy the peace process, and as such, it's very questionable, and this is not just a question with regard to Israel-Palestine, whether interim agreements are really beneficial when you still have large groups who are intent on ensuring that the conflict consists of. That's a very important point to make, because as I'm going to make my final comments at the end of this presentation, I just want to make a few comments about what we think may happen over the next 6 months, a year with the Trump peace proposal, and whether this should be a big proposal or whether it should be an interim. Interim always allows for time. Time on the one hand allows you to work things out if you want to work things out, but time also allows you to destroy processes if that is what the intention of radicals on both sides are about. There's another issue to do with the West Bank territory, and that is, it's to do with terminologies and with polemics. Think of a single English word, the word whole, W-H-O-L-E. Israel says, wow, look at those Palestinians. They're not prepared to give up anything. They want the whole of the West Bank. They're not prepared to give up a single centimetre of territory. The Palestinians say, look at those Israelis. They want the whole of the West Bank, even though the West Bank is only 23% of Mandate Palestine. We already gave up on 75% of Mandate Palestine. All we have left is the West Bank, but the Israelis want the whole of that. So even in a simple word, there are two completely contrary definitions of what that means in terms of the territorial proposal. But over the past 25 years, there has been a lot of discussion about how can you redraw or recreate boundaries so that it would be satisfactory under the context of a two-state solution. And there has been serious discussion about the concept of territorial exchange, which certainly 10 years ago, it was on the agenda of many Track 2 discussions which were taking place. I took part in some of these discussions with academics, with politicians and diplomats. It obviously changed over time. It's very interesting that the new president, or the new prime minister, of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Ashtaya, he and I were present at one of the very first Track 2s that ever took place back in 1990, even prior to the Madrid talks. And we were the two people who presented then a very simple version of a map which said, let's redraw the boundary in such a way as to create territorial exchanges. It was a very crude map, but the principles have remained with us until today. The idea being that if in 1948 the Green Line border was not a good border, it reflected the realities, the military realities, the geopolitical realities of that time, and clearly by 67 it had changed, and by today it's changed even more considerably. So if you're going to go into a peace agreement, you want to at least try and reach, as I said, a solution in which both sides are equally dissatisfied, but which more relates to realities of today than relates to realities of 70 years ago. And the basic principle behind the idea of land exchanges or territorial exchanges was that there are significant Israeli settlement blocks, many of them, most of them, in very close proximity to the Green Line, because the majority of Israelis were prepared to cross the Green Line, some for ideological reasons, true, but many for economic reasons. So they wanted to remain as close as possible to Israel, not to go in the heartland of the West Bank. So the big areas like Gush Etzion, of Elkanah, of Ariel, are all very, very close to the Green Line. And the idea was, as you can see, and this is just one example of many, that you redraw the boundary to include many of the major settlement blocks inside Israel, but in return for which you give up areas of relatively empty territory in Israel, so that the ratio, the 23-77% of territory, remains the same for both sides. That was the first discussion that ever took place between Begin and Abu Mazen back so long ago, and which has repeated itself in many variations as such. Of course, the question of where the empty territory to exchange exists is another question altogether. There are two major potential areas. One is in the south, near where I live, which is emptier on the Israeli side than anywhere else. That's one potential. There was a discussion at the time of expanding the Gaza Strip, because the Gaza Strip is one of the most crowdedly and densely populated regions in the world, along the Egypt-Israel Gaza Strip border. And then, of course, there was also the idea of the northern areas at the north. If you look at this area here, which is called the Triangle, the Mishulash, which includes Arab-Palestinian communities on both sides, and you had a right-wing minister who's probably going to come back into the new government now, Avigdor Lieberman, who of course was always opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state, but he at one point 10 years ago, when there was greater consensus for the two-state solution than there is today, said, you know, I'm against it, but if there is going to be territorial exchange, I want it to take place here, so we'll redraw the boundary in such a way that many of the Palestinian Arab communities that are in Israel today will now find themselves on the West Bank side, the Palestinian state, and instead of a demographic ratio of 80 to 20, there'll be a demographic ratio of 90 to 10. And yet in all public surveys of the Israeli citizenship Palestinian population, it's very clear that they have no desire to be part. They support, obviously, the Palestinian cause, as you would expect them to do, but they do not wish, certainly not in the first stages, to be part of a Palestinian state when they see what is going on with Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Maybe what happened in Gaza could happen in the West Bank. And of course, they've been subject to very different westernization processes as part of Israel over the last 70 years, and therefore they're not particularly keen to do that. In a sense, and this isn't the topic of my discussion, but I'll just make a side comment and say that of course the Palestinian citizenship of Israel is in a very, if I can use a British understatement, as you can see from my accent, I'm originally from Britain, I've lived in Israel for 35 years, but I'm originally from North London. They're in a very difficult situation because many people used to say, oh look, they've now lived for 2 or 3 generations as part of Israel. They could create a sort of a bridge between Palestinians and Israelis. But in reality, neither side trusts them. The Israelis, many Israelis, see them as a fifth column. Yes, they're part of the process. They sit in the Knesset and so on. But nevertheless, they feel themselves to be discriminated. They feel themselves to be second-class citizens. And many Israelis see them, as a potential fifth column, and therefore they've never been included in any Israeli government, even a left-wing government. Equally, the Palestinians don't totally trust them. They see them as having been too subject to the westernization tendencies of education systems, of modernization, as part of Israeli culture and society over the last 70 years, and they don't see them as trustworthy enough to be the real allies as creating a bridge. So they've always been in that very unfortunate situation. And what is very unfortunate is that whereas until about 15 years ago, they used to participate very fully in Israeli election processes with some of the highest participation rates in a country which has high participation rates anyway, over the last 10-15 years they've been withdrawing from the electoral process. Their participation rates are much lower, and this is actually, I feel, a danger to Israel's democracy in the way that even the sensitive and the problematic way that exists today of what their role and status is within Israel society. Having said that, we have been building borders and walls over the last 15 years. The separation barrier and so on. Whether this is beneficial or not depends, I think, to a great extent on the political perspective you look at. It certainly has created a physical barrier between Israel and the West Bank, which means that on the one hand, it may have kept potential infiltrators out, maybe, out, but equally, on the other hand, it has caused all sorts of new issues, not least of which is the fact that the average Israeli Jewish citizen, who, unless you're a settler or someone serving in the army, never crosses into the West Bank, even though you live 20 minutes away, but you sit very comfortably in the high-quality coffee houses of North Tel Aviv, forgetting that there's a conflict so close by, or that there are missiles from Gaza. What woke the Israeli public up recently was one missile that came virtually into the center of the country, which is not difficult to do, by the way. That woke people up and said, oh no, that's something that goes on away from us in the periphery, even though the periphery is pretty close. But today, if you're driving along the Cross-Israel Highway, north to south or south to north, and you look out your window, you see the fence, you see the wall, which means that there is a much more realistic discourse about what borders mean. You see a border, therefore you talk about it, you become aware of it, and therefore there is a much greater, or there has been until recently, a much greater discourse about borders than there were 20 or 30 years ago. Building walls, of course, is questionable, and here you have a great caricature from just 2 years ago when Trump came to Jerusalem. He was the first American president to visit the Western Wall. As you know, people who visit the Western Wall write notes to God and stick them in the wall. And Trump at the time was talking about, as he still is today, building a big wall between the USA and Mexico. And he said, thank you, Jesus, for building this wall that keeps the Mexicans out of Israel. He got a bit confused as to what it was. But this is the one I like. Another, everyone's trying to second guess what did he write on his note. Dear God, please send me the name of the contractor who built this wall. It's lasted for 3,000 years, and look at it. I have a similar project and would like a quote to build my own wall. Humorous, yes, but it says something about the way that walls and borders have come back to haunt us in the contemporary era. There is a lot of talk, there is a lot of rumor going around that Trump has a peace proposal, and that now the elections are behind us. Netanyahu, I think, is very close to putting his new coalition government into effect. It's a very right-of-centre government. If 10 years ago he was the extreme right-winger in a government, today he's a moderate right-winger in a government of many more extreme politicians. The two-state solution is not really out there on the table. It wasn't an issue, it wasn't discussed anywhere in the election process this coming year. And we don't know really what the Trump proposal is. The rumors that have come out have said that it's going to be a much more limited version than maybe was being suggested 20 years ago or 15 years ago when Barack was prime minister and so on. So it's very hard to believe that the Palestinians would be prepared to accept any such proposal as such. Because if Trump was to put something on the table, it would be very hard for Netanyahu to turn around and just say no. Trump and Netanyahu are best buddies. Netanyahu and Obama weren't. Netanyahu's a buddy with Trump, he's a buddy with Putin, he's a buddy with Modi. He's got, you may like or dislike his particular policies, but he's worked hard in the international arena. And he portrayed that during the elections as an experienced leader who's been prime minister for now 10 years, nearly as long as David Ben-Gurion, the state founder, which is quite amazing. But it's going to be very hard for him to turn around to his best buddy, Donald Trump, particularly given the fact that in the last 2 years, Donald Trump has given Netanyahu and Israel a lot of very nice sweets and a lot of very nice presents. Moved the embassy to Jerusalem. No previous American president ever did that. Said that maybe Israel has a right to claim sovereignty over the Golan Heights because of strategic issues. That's changed the ball game. hasn't really said much about Netanyahu's statement that maybe it's time to annex parts of the West Bank, which Israel has never done in the past, mostly because of demographic issues. So to turn around and then say to Trump, no, I'm not prepared to withdraw, to give up anything, or to go according to peace plan, is going to be much more difficult for Netanyahu than it was when he was talking to President Obama. And this is, of course, one of the great unknowns that we don't know. And we're waiting to see whether all these rumors about what we understand is quite a detailed peace plan is going to materialize or not over the next few months. My final comment about drawing borders and territory is to say that, of course, we do live, as I said at the beginning, in a small piece of territory with an increasing number of people. There have been countless proposals at redrawing borders. And of course, in today's world, what we believe in discussing, certainly at the theoretical or philosophical levels, is why do we need separate spaces? Why can't we create shared spaces? Spaces where peoples can live with a separation of power, but they don't necessarily need fences. Not always, if you know the famous poem of Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors, but if you have good neighbors, you don't necessarily need good fences. And that's the other side of that famous statement. Of course, it is so intricate today. Not just the Israeli settlements, that's one factor. 500,000. No left-wing government could forcefully evacuate 500,000 settlers. And there's not a left-wing government, and you saw that the left completely collapsed in this past election. I mean, it was an election between centre and right, and the left weren't in there at all. And there are many reasons to explain this. Maybe Asher Susa spoke about it, I don't know. But that's a whole nother lecture to talk about. But shared spaces is a very nice concept. You can have it maybe to a certain extent in a Western Europe, even with Brexit, but on the whole is at peace with itself and lives in relative harmony and stability compared to where it was after World War II 70 years ago. You don't have that in Israel-Palestine. But one of the questions that many of us who have supported and promoted the two-state solution for many years as the best of all the bad proposals is that have the realities on the ground changed so much that it is no longer possible to draw a simple border? In which case, are there ways of thinking beyond the territorial box, whereby you don't create borders, you don't draw lines, but you have enclaves and exclaves and power sharing and alternative citizenships? That's much more complex. And given the animosity and the hatred that exists between the two sides, probably even more difficult to see materializing. But the question that many of us who are pragmatists, not ideologues who oppose two-state solutions for ideological reasons, far right in Israel because they believe the whole of the land was given to the Jewish people by God, therefore there shouldn't be another state. Or the far left, or many of the Palestinians who believe we're in a post-nation-state era, therefore there should be a single binational secular democracy which should neither be Jewish or Muslim, etc. Those are ideological positions. But many of us who have always promoted the two-state solution as the best of all the bad solutions believe that it's no longer possible to draw these boundaries, and therefore we have to think beyond the territorial box. It sounds very far-reaching, it sounds very fictional, but crazier things have happened in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Thank you.